So Aaron, you're widely known in the press in the circle of folks that live and breathe drug shortages and an expert in the field. Tell us, let's roll back all the way to the beginning. Where, much like the flu starts in the Pacific Rim, where do drug shortages start? And then where do they end up on our doorstep?
That's a great question. So, drug shortages really start at the manufacturing factory. At the factory, when that factory has a problem, because that factory usually doesn't have an extra line or extra capacity or a backup plan in many cases, they can't make up the difference. And so when that manufacturing problem happens, it almost always results in a drug shortage.
And so starts there at the manufacturer. How does that roll down from there then? So it's going from manufacturer to wholesaler.
Sure, yeah. So when you think about product being manufactured, manufacturers don't have 6 months to a year's worth of product on hand. They have small amounts. They do just-in-time manufacturing. And so when there's a glitch and they're supposed to send product to the distributors, the wholesalers, and onto the hospitals, any kind of a glitch there is probably going to result in a 2 to 3 month period of time when you're going to maybe not get the deliveries that you're hoping for, or not as much product as you're hoping for.
And it's interconnected too, it sounds like, because there's there's substrate products that go into the manufacturing of the drug product. There's
Sure. It can start with
labeling
the
and
yeah,
glassware and all sorts of other things. So
yeah.
this sort of interconnected global supply chain, it sounds like. Can you describe that?
Sure. So most of the raw materials, the active pharmaceutical ingredient or API, all of those are synonyms. The raw materials come from China and India in the majority of cases. So when there's a problem there, clearly the manufacturers can't make the product, but manufacturers do have to purchase a large number of other products to make their products. Glass vials, sometimes there's a shortage of those. Problems with syringes, problems with rubber seals inside the syringes. So all of those additional materials can pose some manufacturing problems. But the manufacturer is in charge of making sure that they have good supplies of all of those products, including the raw materials. So that's kind of why I say that it starts at the manufacturer, but you're right. There's a large amount of other components that go into it.
I mean, Rich, this sounds to me a little bit like we had a scenario where there was a car manufacturer within a couple months ago where a certain part couldn't be made. There was a factory that was shut down, or somewhere in the supply chain that part couldn't be made, and it essentially stopped the line for the entire manufacturing of a line of transportation vehicles. Is it very similar to that in the drug supply chain?
That's the perfect analogy. I mean, when you look at all that goes into making a sterile product and all the checkpoints and all the validation and all the testing, and then everything comes to a screeching halt because I can't get the glass to make the vial, or I don't have enough labels manufactured and printed and ready to go, or the rubber stopper doesn't work with the drug because my supplier changed their formulation. So it's multifactorial, and as Aaron said, it's a process that's owned by the vendor. But you're right, one little hiccup in any of that flow of work and flow of production shuts down the whole line.
And API stands for what?
Active pharmaceutical ingredients.
API stands for active pharmaceutical ingredients. And where do most of those ingredients come from?
They come from China, India, for the most part.
So we're clearly connected in the world. So there was a recent shutdown in McPherson, Kansas. Just using that as an example, here you are downstream at the health systems and you see a shutdown and immediately you start planning for that? Is that how it works?
Well, we don't see the shutdown or the FDA comments usually until we start feeling the shortage. And then we have to sort of back into what the problem is.
So you're catching up.
So we're catching up. I think once we find out what the problem is, we can kind of guesstimate whether it's going to be short-term or long-term. Mm-hmm. I think the problem is knowing what the issue is that's causing the problem. Where's the hiccup? And that isn't always available to us.
So Aaron, again, you travel the country working on these issues. You've been working with drug shortages in particular for 20 years, a luminary in the field. Do we not have an early warning system for this?
We don't. That's the gold standard. One of the most frustrating things about drug shortages is how reactive you have to be. There's no way to become proactive because there's no requirement for a drug company to tell you that they're not going to have a your product available for you. Half the time, the drug companies don't even do a good job of telling the FDA, and that's a law that's required. And so having to be reactive all the time is very, very frustrating. For example, the McPherson, Kansas closure, we found out about that months later, and that was only because the drug company chose to tell us. In many cases, we actually never find out, especially if it's a privately held company.
Interesting. And so give me an example of some of the downstream effects of that. So you have a drug shortage. How does this impact patients' lives? I mean, what's the pragmatic result of these shortages?
Well, I think at the most basic level, the impact is they don't get the treatment that they need, or there's a delay in their treatment. Luckily, those types of shortages are very uncommon, but they're also at more risk of having a medication error. When hospitals have to use, a 2 ml vial versus a 5 ml vial or a 10 ml vial, all to have the same drug available for the patients, accidents can happen and medication errors can happen, and so patients are at risk there as well.
We talked about facilities shutting down. We talked about supply chain issues from raw materials. What other reasons might shortages come to pass?
Market consolidation. A company will either be purchased or just drop the product line. Profit margin, these are, companies are publicly held and they have a obligation to their shareholders to generate revenue. So,
So what's happened over the past 20 years that might have amplified that scenario?
I think we've had a few people drop out of the market. We've had, Benvenue, Bedford, those people dropped out, left us a big hole. People scrambled. We've had some consolidation mergers where product lines have to be divested. And when they're divested, there's a whole process. Somebody else has to pick them up. So it's a lot of different moving parts in the industry just under ownership and who's making what.
So is it fair to say that there's more single point of failures today in the supply chain than there was in the past, where it might have been buffered by 2 or 3 or 4 folks in the marketplace or substitutions that would work just fine?
I think for the most part we're at single source or dual source on a lot of products that are mission critical.
So single point of failure is not anything from a public health or Department of Defense, critical infrastructure, when you have those phrases come to mind. Aaron, again, as a national expert, how does this relate to some basic public health, bioterrorism, Department of Defense, et cetera? I mean, is this an issue that gets talked about in DC and out there from a critical infrastructure perspective as well?
It is, and there is a thought that are some medications so critical, like think about saline, that is so essential. It's not only a treatment, but it's also supply. Should that be considered part of a critical infrastructure? Be required to have backup plans and a little bit of redundancy? Those discussions are ongoing, but I think it'll be a little bit of time before we see any movement there. But it is a national security issue when we don't have all of the medications that our hospitals need, when we are short of the most basic products. Another way to think of our basic shortages right now are kitchen cupboard shortages. We're short of dextrose, we're short of sodium bicarb, so sugar and baking soda and water. These basics should be available to all hospitals, and they're not.
It's interesting. So just-in-time inventory then has done a lot for making things more efficient, but it's just in time. So you're relying on that just being on time every day, right? I mean, is that part of the evolution as well that's caused some issues?
Yeah, I think that you are spot on with that. And having a certain amount of supply, yes, it's got cost savings to the company, but if they get caught short, if there's any one of the multifactorial parts of getting that product to market has a hiccup, then yeah, just-in-time inventory means we don't have it.
So we also have acts of God, and it seems like acts of God have been happening with more frequency lately. So what about something like a Hurricane Maria? Were both of you impacted by Hurricane Maria?
We were for a little bit. The vendors we use weren't quite as affected as some of the other hospitals in our neighborhoods. The power grid going down, they can have all the product they want, but
Sure.
if you don't have power to the plant, nothing's coming out the back door. So.
Sure, and where I'm from, we just had Florence. We actually had 3 hurricanes meander through North Carolina this year. But also, there's one of the largest typhoons in the history of humankind went through the other hemisphere, that can affect us as well, right? So this interconnectedness is fascinating to think about from a drug supply chain perspective. But there's also the evolution of, I think our generic dispensing rate is 90-something% now. Is that affected? How does that have been affected in the drug supply?
Depends on where you sit. For the acute care space, probably it affects us a little bit more, but as more and more things get patient-specific, and some of the branded biosimilars and other things that are coming in this precision medicine, I think we're kind of just starting to touch on that right now.